Hi, this is Adam Jones. I'm the COO at SimulTrans, the localization and technical translation company. Often we have our customers ask if it makes sense to engage in a master service agreement for localization. So we put together this presentation to highlight some of the benefits of this approach. A master service agreement is sometimes referred to as an MSA. In essence, it's a contract between a company and, in this case, its localization service provider. Of course, sometimes companies have master service agreements for other types of services. The purpose is to define the relationship between the companies. So it's similar to a contract that you might engage in for an individual localization project. However, it typically lasts for 1 to 3 years, covering a series of projects during that time. And it would define the basic terms by which the companies work together, including information on confidentiality, rates, services required, and other important legal terms. One of the most important goals and benefits of an MSA is to lock in the rates. Costs for localization can vary over time, particularly since many of the people involved in the localization process are located around the world. The costs can be affected fairly heavily by exchange rate fluctuations between countries. There also is an impact on supply and demand, where a particular language might be in high demand, and therefore translation resources for that target country are more costly, and so rates go up. We also have heard that many localization firms can get a bit greedy with their existing customers, increasing the rates over time. Of course, at SimulTrans, we avoid that practice and try to keep rates pretty consistent from the outset of the relationship, but still, we recommend an MSA for our clients. So for example, say you were paying 22 cents per word for translation in a certain language for your first project. Sometimes you might see a second project or one a few months down the line, you might get proposals for 25 cents a word, a significant increase. And by signing an MSA, you're avoiding that kind of rate increase by locking in the rates for the term of the agreement. Another advantage is the opportunity to receive discounts. Localization service providers would often provide a discount based on a couple of factors, one of those being the volume of work, and that could be tracked on an annual basis. For example, if you have a certain number of words or spend a certain amount of money, you can begin getting discounts based on that. Another factor that can play into the discount is an exclusive relationship. So if you decide to work with just one company for all of your localization needs, you might be able to get more favorable pricing than if you divide your translation work among a number of service providers. The MSA is a great place to define what those discounts are to make sure that you're maximizing the potential to save money in that regard. Another advantage is simplifying the accounting process. We find that sometimes companies that have a larger volume of projects that tend to be smaller projects but more frequent can take a lot of accounting work for them to process. And so by having an agreement in place that defines the rates and the terms, you don't have to go through that contract negotiation and order process for every project, but instead you might be able to issue an open purchase order and then you can track the costs of the projects throughout the month and receive just one monthly invoice for all of those. That allows you to be able to predict what your costs will be without having to go through an approval process for every single request. We find this is a good approach for small and frequent projects. On the other hand, if you tend to have larger projects that take a longer period of time, often a statement of work approach is a good way to go. This will define the terms in some detail for the project, but allow you to avoid renegotiating the entire contract. This would serve usually as an attachment to the master service agreement and can be added on for every project that you would create during that term. The idea here would be that you want to clearly define what the responsibilities are of the localization service provider for each assignment. So for example, you might have one project where software testing is required, and so it would be important to clearly label that in the agreement. And then for other projects, you might not require testing, and so that could be laid out. This is usually a good approach for larger projects. Another advantage you get by executing an MSA is to protect your intellectual property. You can require ownership of the work product so that the translations that are created are clearly owned by your company. It's also helpful to confirm moral rights assignment to avoid claims over translation content in other countries. Some countries protect translation as a moral right, that the person who's created it does have some rights to that work. And so typically a master service agreement would assign those rights to the customer who's purchased the translation. And if that's not possible in some countries, we find it's helpful to include this clause highlighted in green, that if such a waiver is not permissible, that then the localization service provider would still grant permission to fully use and edit and have control over and authorship over that localized content. And then finally, in terms of intellectual property, it's important to define the terms of protecting disclosure of confidential information. Sometimes we sign non-disclosure agreements which are separate from the MSA, but it's also good to include those terms in how to protect the confidential information in a master service agreement. Some additional points that you might want to include if you're creating an agreement with your localization service provider are to make sure that you own the translation memory. At SimulTrans, we always expect our clients to have ownership over that, but some companies feel differently, and so it's important to define that up front. It's also helpful for you to include sufficient time to review the deliverables that you receive and to insist on a free round of changes. Some localization companies tend to split hairs over what's a preferential change versus an actual error, and we see that the vast majority of changes requested usually are preferential changes, that they might be requests of certain terminology that a customer prefers or a different writing style that might be more favorable. And so it's helpful to insist that you're going to require a round of changes, even if they might be considered preferential, since you do want that final outcome to really reflect the input of your reviewers fully, and you don't want to have to pay extra for incorporating those modifications. Finally, it's helpful to require advance approval of any change orders. During the project, you might update your files or send some additional components that require translation. We've heard of some of our customers that have worked with other localization service providers in the past who have been shocked with the final bill they've received because it's incorporated charges for some of those pieces without any kind of advance notice. And so it's good in this MSA to include terms that if something does change, you want to be notified about that in advance and have an opportunity to give an approval for that additional work. And if you need help creating an MSA, we're certainly happy to help. You can let us know at SimulTrans. We also have a draft of a standard MSA that we use that we would be happy to share with you, that you could work with your legal team to customize for your company. Here's my contact information. You can certainly reach out to me directly anytime, or if there are other colleagues at SimulTrans you work with, you can reach out to them as well. Thanks for your interest in the MSA process, and good luck with your localization projects.